All right, good afternoon, ancient Roman history students. This is your lecture for Tuesday, what is it, April 21st. We're going to be exploring the Gracchi, as they like to be referred to, the brothers Tiberius. Some say Gaius, some say Caius. It kind of depends upon the translation that you use. I like to say Gaius because it's a little bit easier to say. So we're going to refer to them as Tiberius and Gaius. And so this is a very, very important episode in the history of the Republic. You might say that the seeds of the Roman Empire were laid by Hannibal himself, because what it took to defeat the military genius Hannibal required a massive amount of centralization of authority, the expansion of territory. Now, of course, Rome had been fighting with Carthage and its neighbors for a while, so it's not just completely on somebody like Hannibal. But the Republic, even with its problems and its class conflicts, seemed to be functioning at a pretty high level. But when Hannibal came around, he ended up basically changing the center of gravity away from the Senate and more toward military leaders. And so, as the Roman territory began to expand into Macedonia and Greece and other places, when we looked at it last week, we knew that there were these kind of powerful trends that were away from kind of a almost part-time militia style military that was designed to defend Rome from outside forces, and more toward kind of a larger standing army that would have to be paid for by a large bureaucracy and taxes and tribute from large overseas territories, which would then require more soldiers, and then that you need to have more territory to pay for them. And it's almost like a Ponzi scheme that ends up getting built up over time. But at the time of the Gracchi, who they were, Tiberius died in 133 BC, and his brother died 12 years later. There was really no thought that the Republic would end. There was no thought that the empire was on its way. And so, if Hannibal sowed the seeds of the empire, you might say that the Gracchi began to build the coffin of the Republic. And this is a classic example, I think, of unintended consequences, because both men, if you read their biographies, and of course that's the reading for today, you're supposed to read Plutarch's Lives and the biography written by both about both brothers. If you read them, these men were classic Republican politicians. They sought to represent the interests of their people. They served the Republic well, and they wanted to do good. Res publica, for the public interest. And so the fact that you would have these great Republican, small r Republican leaders leading to the demise of the Republic bears some explanation. So let's see what that brings us. So half the talk today will be about Tiberius, and the other half will be about Gaius. And I think that's the value of a biography, is that you can see history through the exploits and the character and the missteps of human beings, and that's why Plutarch was read widely at the time of the founding of our country. Most of our founding fathers saw themselves as kind of replicating certain great figures, either from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So anyway, that'll be the plan of attack, and then you should have your Google Forms assignment due for Cato, Marcus Cato. So that's due today, and then this assignment, this Google Forms assignment, will be due for tomorrow. Okay. All right. So let's dive into Tiberius now. Both Tiberius and Gaius were their parents were Tiberius Gracchus Senior, or the elder, I guess you'd say, and Cornelia. And if you might remember, Cornelia is the daughter of Scipio Africanus. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We remember that in some respects, Marcus Cato, Cato the Elder, was a political rival of the Scipios, but of course, both of them fought vigorously against Hannibal. And so Cornelia is the mother of the Gracchi brothers and takes great amount of pride. In fact, she, I think, in part of the biography, says that she would rather be known as the mother of the Gracchi as opposed to the daughter of Scipio. Okay. Um, and there was actually some mention that she was a pretty impressive person in her own right. The father died when the kids were actually quite young, and so it was really the mother that was raising both boys. Um, you might say that the Gracchi were known more for their education than their birth. So these are middle class, maybe upper middle class, maybe today, but their credentials are really kind of they brought themselves up by their bootstraps, and they were a meritocracy as opposed to an aristocracy. I think that also explains that when there are these political fights that they're engaged in, they're always taking the side of the little guy as opposed to siding with the Senate and the patricians. Um, Plutarch takes some effort to distinguish kind of some of the character differences between the two brothers, and I think anybody who has family, you can tell sometimes that brothers are different and they have different character traits. Give me a second; I need to open up the door for my dog. He'll be back, I'm sure. There you go. So Tiberius, he's the elder brother. He was some of the adjectives gentle and composed. Gaius was earnest and vehement. Gaius's oratory was impetuous and passionate. Tiberius's was calm. Tiberius was frugal and plain. Gaius was fond of new fashions. Okay. And then he talks about their tempers. Tiberius was mild and reasonable. The other rough and passionate. Okay. Plutarch also points out that Roman history might have been very different if the brothers had been closer in age. There was a 9-year difference, and so it was very difficult for them to kind of team up because of the differences of ages. And remember, back then, people kind of grew up fast, and so by the time Tiberius was really, in his military career and his political career, and then all the reforms he was pushing, his younger brother still was in school. So they really never had an opportunity to kind of join forces, which might have made it very difficult for them to be stopped. Okay. Again, Plutarch is really trying to make the point that people like Tiberius were, their position in Roman society and politics was by virtue of their virtue, and not because of their connections or something like that. He was married to the daughter of a Roman senator, Appius Claudius, consul, censor, and now head of the Roman Senate. And he was very excited that he had gotten Tiberius to marry his daughter, and so was his wife. She said she was amazed that he had married off his daughter so quickly. She said, "Only person that I would want you to have married her off to was Tiberius." And then when he told the wife that it was Tiberius, he thought, "Oh my gosh, this is the best thing. This is the best thing ever." He served under Scipio the Younger. Okay, remember the grandson of Scipio Africanus, who led the Roman expedition to Carthage during the Third Punic War, really the burning and the pillaging of Carthage. It was mentioned that he was the first to mount the enemy's walls. Okay. He also spent some time under the command of Gaius Mancinius when they were finding the Numantines, which was a province in between Spain and Africa. Okay, and he actually, because of his ability of negotiation, saved roughly 20,000 Roman citizens who were actually had been captured by the Numantine authorities. After his military career, um, he was given a praetorship, which is kind of like being the governor and also the treasurer of Sardinia. Hold on for a second. Sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay. Next thing that Plutarch goes into some great detail on, of course, is the land reform situation that Tiberius is involved with. Let me read this to you so that you are fully aware. And again, Bauer points this out too, but I think it's good coming from the horse's mouth. This is according to Plutarch. Of the land which the Romans gained by conquest from their neighbors, part they sold publicly. Okay, so they sold part of the land they got from their conquest, and then turned the remainder into common land. This common land they assigned to such of the citizens as were poor and indigent, for which they were to pay only a small acknowledgement into the public treasury, so kind of like a flat tax. But when the wealthy men began to offer large rents and drive the poorer people out, it was enacted by law that no person whatever should enjoy more than 500 acres of ground. So when you saw some of the problems with the rich people kind of snatching up some of this land, some of the politicians wanted to kind of ease some of the conflict between the patricians and the plebeians. And when that didn't work, legislation was passed to actually limit the amount of land holdings to 500 acres, which, if you asked me, was probably a pretty good idea. If you fast forward to the 19th and early 20th century, Chesterton, who were at Chesterton School, he advocated a form of economic capitalism called distributism, which was the idea is that the problem with capitalism that it wasn't enough capitalists, so you would give people a land, a stake in the society, and then they became better citizens. So they were kind of going back to these kinds of reforms that were going on during this period of time in the Roman Republic. Afterwards, though, the rich men of the neighborhood contrived to get these lands again into their possession under other people's names, and at last would not stick to claim most of them publicly in their own. So basically what they did is they tried to get around the law of the 500 acres, and they would create dummy names and dummy companies, buy them up under false names, and then end up getting the land themselves. So that the poor ended up, even though the reform was there, and again, this was kind of the setting for when Tiberius is starting to get into politics. This is not his reforms; these are the reforms that preceded him. And so the poor really, despite their best intentions of some of the politicians, had been deprived of their rightful land because they had been promised this land primarily as a way of payment for serving in the Roman military. Okay. His first office, he was elected tribune of the people. Okay. He was known again as a very, very good orator. He got advice from several people in terms of his new reforms. Crassus, the high priest, Scaevola, a lawyer, Claudius Appius, his father-in-law. Never did any law appear more moderate and gentle, especially being enacted against such great oppression and avarice. So in a lot of ways, Tiberius is trying to kind of set a kind of middle ground between just basically, what you might call proto-socialism, basically taking all the land from the rich and redistributing it. But basically just saying, look, if you get new land, some of it needs to go to the people who don't have it, that you're actually going to relieve a lot of economic problems within the society and kind of defuse class conflict, which usually leads to rebellion. Okay, but because he was trying to take away some of these profits of some of these very wealthy landowners, he ended up becoming a an enemy of the wealthy. Okay, now his political opponent was another tribune by the name of Marcus Octavius, who originally was thought to be also a very steady, solid, orderly politician. And he was actually a friend of Tiberius. But he ended up becoming kind of everyone knew that you couldn't get Tiberius to kind of switch sides. So a lot of the rich and powerful focused their bribes and focused their attention on Marcus Octavius. Tiberius, irritated at these proceedings, presently laid aside this milder bill. So originally he was just going to have a little bit of redistribution. But when he found out that his colleague had been bribed, um, ended up proposing a much more I wouldn't call it radical, but a much more comprehensive land reform proposal. Okay. So when Tiberius found out that Marcus Octavius was basically corrupt, um, he then interposed an edict prohibiting all magistrates to exercise their respective functions till at such time as the law was either ratified or rejected by public vote. So this is the first instance where you might argue that Tiberius is going kind of outside of the law, okay? Because there's really no provision for this in the Roman Constitution to kind of have a suspension of normal operating businesses. So they basically wanted to put Rome at a standstill, force the vote, and basically focus everyone's attention on this particular reform. He threatened to impose a severe fine upon those of the praetors who presumed to disobey his commands. So he's basically telling people to um, um, basically almost like a dictator in a way, right, without having been appointed one. Upon this, the rich proprietors put themselves into mourning and wept up and down, melancholy and dejected. They entered into a conspiracy against Tiberius and procured men to murder him, so that he also, with all his men's knowledge, wherever he went abroad, he would bring a sword and a staff because he was worried about his safety. Okay, so it came time for the vote, and the vote went Tiberius's way. Okay, Tiberius considered the mischiefs that were now occurring, and having a great respect for two such eminent persons, demanded of them they would go advise him to do so. So he seeks advice from members of the Senate. At this point, he then decides that he is going to refer the whole matter to the people. We would call this today a referendum. So the idea would be that there would be a proposal that would be drafted by lawmakers, and Tiberius is one of them. And then they would ask the people to say yes or no, to basically approve of the bill produced by the lawmakers. That's what we call a referendum. And so essentially that's what Tiberius is asking the Roman people to do. The only problem is that there's nothing in the Roman Constitution that would allow such a referendum. as there is nothing in the U.S. Constitution for a referendum. There is such a thing at the state level. Michigan has it, Pennsylvania has it, many states have referendum. It's the primary way that they amend their state constitution. But in this respect, there is no U.S. constitutional referendum, right? And there was no Roman referendum. But Tiberius is kind of making it up as he goes along. So one of the real classic questions to ask yourself here is, do the ends justify the means? Clearly there is corruption in Rome, and his fellow tribune is being bribed. And Tiberius recognizes this. So he believes that because the system is already broken, that he is justified in some respects breaking the system again, but in this case for the betterment of the people. Okay, so he called on the people to vote at once, whether Octavius should be deposed or not because of his opposition to the law. And when 17 of the 35 tribes had voted against him, so basically they voted by almost like by state, a tribe would have been considered like a voting bloc. And so it required a majority of the tribes of Rome to favor a particular bill. And so he's one short of the majority. So when 17 had voted yes, he stopped the vote and asked Octavian to basically go along with the land reform. He refused, and then they ended up passing the reform, and really it was a almost a unanimous vote in favor of the reforms of Tiberius. So one of the, again, ironies here is that the reforms were popular and the reforms passed, but there was still some question about the legality of all this because he's going outside of the ordinary constitutional process. And you think about our history, Lincoln is considered to be a great, great president. But in a lot of ways, he violated certain portions of the United States Constitution. He would argue, was there ever a more dire circumstance than the Civil War? So are you going, the Constitution is not a death pact, that you can actually maybe suspend the ordinary operations of the Constitution in order to save the Constitution. This is kind of what Tiberius is actually looking for. So the bill passes and Claudius is moved out of the way. At that point, they created a land commission to help with the redistribution of the land. This was another kind of misstep, a lot of people argue, with the Gracchi, because who did he put on the commission? He put his brother, Gaius, himself, and his father-in-law, Claudius Appius. Now, I think the reason why he did it was that there weren't a lot of people that he trusted in Rome to do it right. But what does it look on the outside? On the outside looking in, it looks like he's just got he's got his family members working on land reform, and who's going to benefit from it? Maybe themselves. Okay. And he didn't ask any of the great patrician leaders and senators to be on the commission as well. And so this ended up offending many of the great men of the city. Okay, let's see here. I think that's important. Okay, so here's a speech by Tiberius, which I think is actually good to kind of read a little portion of it to give you an idea of kind of where he's coming from at this particular time. Okay, he said, "A tribune of the people is sacred indeed, and ought to be inviolable, because in a manner consecrated to be the guardian and protector of the people. But if he degenerates so far as to oppress the people, abridge their powers, and take away their liberty of voting, he stands deprived of his own act of honors and immunities." You can kind of hear a little bit of the Declaration of Independence here, where, what's the job of the representative? It's to represent the people. Where does he get its power from? The consent of the governed. And what happens when the guardians of the people actually take away the rights of the people? He says, otherwise he should be under the obligation to let a tribune do this pleasure, though he should proceed to destroy the capital or set fire to the arsenal. He who should make these attempts would be a bad tribune. He who assails the power of the people is no longer a tribune at all. Is it not inconceivable that a tribune should have power to imprison a consul, and the people have no authority to degrade him when he uses that honor which he received from them to their detriment? He actually brings up Tarquin. He says, but the citizens, notwithstanding this, deposed Tarquin when he acted wrongfully. And for the crime of one single man, the ancient government under which Rome was built was abolished forever. So he said, look, there were times when you actually had to change the system to make the system better. We did it when we changed from a kingship to a republic. And what he's suggesting here is that maybe an alteration of the republic is in order to actually save the republic. Okay? And so this was kind of his almost apology, his explanation for why he did what he did against Marcus Octavius. Right? But it still remained kind of a consensus among especially the elites that he had gone beyond his constitutional authority. Acting almost like a quasi-dictator, he also suggests that the Senate be expanded to increase the number of people in the Senate, to allow them to have people in what we call the equestrian order, which is kind of halfway between patrician and plebeian. And this was a way to kind of lessen the power of the patricians within inside the Senate. Okay, and so he ended up really becoming kind of a man of the people against these powerful entrants. At that point, his enemies start to plot to kill him. Okay, so Plutarch goes into some detail about how this happens. One of his detractors, Flavius Flaccus, a senator standing in a place where he could be seen from Tiberius, signified to him by motions of his hand that he wished to impart something of consequence to him in private. Okay, that he should be assassinated. Tiberius no sooner communicated this confessory to those about him that they immediately tucked up their gowns, broke their halberds, which the officers used to keep the crowd into pieces, and distributed them among themselves, resolving to resist the attack with these. So basically, it ends up becoming kind of a free-for-all. And Bauer actually, if you remember, the way she describes the incident is that it was basically a riot. It was a rocks, and it was, even though they had wanted to kill Tiberius, it really wasn't well planned. He said the attendants then they brought with them had furnished themselves with clubs and staves from their houses. They picked themselves up the feet and other fragments of stools and chairs which were broken by the hasty flight of the common people. Thus armed, they made towards Tiberius, knocked him down, and those who soon wholly dispersed, and many of them were slain. Tiberius tried to save himself by flight. As he was running, he was stopped by one who caught hold of him by his gown, threw it off, fled in his undergarment only. And stumbling over those who before him had knocked him down as he was endeavoring to get up, Publius Satirius, a tribune, one of his colleagues, was observed to give him the first fatal stroke. So another one of his fellow tribunes killed him by hitting him upon the head with the foot of a stool. The second blow was claimed as though it had been a deed to be proud of by Lucius Rufus. So Plutarch here is naming names. And the rest there fell above 300 killed by clubs and staves only, none of an iron weapon. So again, this is kind of just a free-for-all. They had not brought real weapons with them. And from what you remember with Bauer, the people were thrown into the river along with Tiberius himself, so they didn't even have the courtesy to give him a proper burial. Plutarch starts to conclude by saying it is evident that this conspiracy was fomented against him more out of hatred and malice, which the rich men had to his person than for the reasons which they commonly pretended against him. So, you know, according to Plutarch, what he would say is that the rich and the powerful were against Tiberius not because of the laws that he was passing, but because they were jealous of his position with the people. Okay, and so immediately afterwards, the Senate, to soothe the people, did not oppose the division of the public lands. It prevented them to choose another commissioner in the room of Tiberius. So they had elected Publius Crassus, who was Gracchus's near connection. The people, however, showed evident marks of their anger at Tiberius's death and were clearly waiting for the opportunity to be revenged. All right, so it really doesn't, there's kind of a calm, kind of almost settling of the issue for a while, but everybody knows that both sides are kind of just waiting for the next round of the fight. And the next round of the fight is brother Gaius Gracchus. So at this time, the brother is involved. He's basically in school, and he's embarking on his own career. And originally, because he had seen what had happened, he wasn't immediately quite interested in following in his brother's footsteps. We talked about some of the differences between him and his older brother. So he's kind of more like a hothead. I wouldn't say that he was, completely intemperate, but compared to his brother, he was much more aggressive in the way that he went about his public career. Okay, but I think there were a lot of people who were encouraging him to kind of follow in his brother's footsteps. So even though originally he had claimed that he wanted to stay out of politics, by the time he was in his late 20s, he was being encouraged to do so. He was first elected as a quaestor. So a quaestor is more like a treasurer, and so this is a position that was more of an administrative position as opposed to actually making law. So that's a little bit different than his brother, although Gaius is going to become a tribune in his own right. Okay, Plutarch mentions that Gaius was a far more thorough demagogue and more ambitious than Tiberius had been. A demagogue is somebody who really riles up the people for not only the people's benefit, but also for his own benefit. So there's something a little bit more self-interested about Gaius as opposed to Tiberius, but both see themselves as advancing the interests of the little guy as opposed to the elite, rich, and powerful who are snatching up all this land and preventing regular people from having it. All right. His tenure in Sardinia was very successful. Plutarch describes it as temperate, frugal, and industrious. He helped ship corn that was needed to other parts of the republic. He was actually accused of misallocation or misappropriation of funds, but when he was allowed to explain himself, everyone understood that he was doing it actually to help a famine and not to basically waste food and waste resources. It said when it came to the execution of his office, it was seen presently who was really first tribune, as he was a better orator than any of his contemporaries, and the passion with which he still lamented his brother's death made him the bolder in speaking. So eventually he ends up becoming one of the tribunes. So he ended up proposing a series of laws. He starts with two. So let's give you a little description of both laws. The first one was that whoever was turned out of any public office by the people should be thereby rendered incapable of bearing any office afterwards. In other words, if you lost a public election or an office, then that would disqualify you from running again. So I'm just trying to give you an example that you might, that might make sense to you. Okay, Hillary Clinton. So she lost the presidential election in 2016. Therefore, under this proposal, she would not be allowed to run for any other office afterwards. So it's kind of like almost like a mega term limit. Second, that if any magistrate or public official condemn a Roman to be banished without a legal trial, the people be authorized to make note of it and actually maybe to do something about it. So both of these are directed toward powerful politicians who are trying to gain power. If they lose, they try to run again, and then they use the legal process to try to get rid of their political enemy. So both of these are trying to kind of take a bite out of the power of some of these patrician politicians. One of these, they were also leveled toward Marcus Octavius, who we know was the tribune with Tiberius Gracchus, who had basically vetoed the land reform bill that his older brother was for. And so when Gaius ends up having some of his initial efforts foiled, he ends up actually becoming a little bit more radical and proposing even more thoroughgoing reforms. So the first was concerning the public lands. They were to be divided amongst the poor citizens, so that's so far sounds like his brother. Another was concerning the common soldiers. So this one, that they would be clothed by the public, so they would not have to be responsible for paying for their uniform. That would be paid for by public taxes. Okay. Another law gave the same right to all the Italians in general of voting at elections as was enjoyed by all the citizens of Rome. So by the time you get to, when did Gaius die? By the time you get to 120 BC, there is no more civitas sine suffragio, the citizenship without the vote. Gaius is trying to say, look, if you're in Italy, you're a Roman and you get the right to vote. So he's expanding the franchise, democratizing the system. And you can see here that his brother, Gaius, is going way beyond his brother in terms of reform. It's not just land reform, this is political reform that he is talking about. A fourth one related to the price of corn, which was to be sold at a lower rate than formerly to the poor. So he's imposing price controls and price limits on food. If you remember your Coriolanus, that was something that Coriolanus was very much against, what Gaius is for. And fifth, a regulated courts of justice, reducing the power of senators who would actually play role as judges in cases, kind of like in our system that would be a violation of separation of powers for legislators actually functioning as judges. Here, he's trying to separate that out because that's what senators had been doing. Now, he also tries to expand the number of equestrians into the senators, almost like packing the Senate with people that might be supportive of his proposals. Okay, so this is much more of a democratic reform agenda than his brother. So this is Plutarch. He says an insignificant movement and change of posture, yet it marked no small revolution in state affairs. The conversion in a manner of the whole government from an aristocracy, which is ruled by the few, to a democracy ruled by the many. So in some ways, what Gaius Gracchus is up to is he's trying to shift the Roman Republic almost to like an Athenian-style democracy. His action intimating that public speakers should address themselves to the people and not the Senate. So you're not going to be kind of, addressing and trying to pass law through the elite channels. Now you're going to try to actually speak to the public and try to influence the Senate really through popular opinion. which you could say is something that's just kind of part and parcel with our politics today. But our founding fathers were very wary of this kind of direct democracy stuff. But Gaius Gracchus is a lot more of a small d Democrat than his brother, who I might call a small r Republican. Okay, when he ended up getting power, he ended up doing what a lot of people do is he put the people to work on public projects. We would call these things infrastructure or internal improvements. He was famous for his construction of new roads and bridges in Rome, divided the roads into mile markers, erected pillars of stone to identify the distance from one place to another. So he's building great public works that are also endearing him to the public. So again, he's giving them the vote, he's giving them land, he's giving them jobs. Um, you can see why the elites are very very nervous about somebody like Gaius Gracchus. Um, he goes further. He proposed that a colony of Roman citizens might be sent to repeople Tarentum and Capua to give the Latins the same privileges as the citizens of Rome. And at last, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And so the elites get a demagogue of their own and put up in opposition to Gaius Gracchus a man by the name of Livius Drusus. He was a fellow tribune with Gaius, a person of as good a family and as well educated as any among the Romans, and no ways inferior to those for whom their eloquence and riches were the most honored and powerful at that time. So he ended up kind of being put forth as kind of the anti Gaius. Okay. In all of his speeches, Livius always told them that he proposed no laws but such as were agreeable to the Senate, who had a particular regard to the people's advantage. So Livius is basically saying, hey, I'm with the Senate, and the Senate is where your interests lie, not with Gaius and the tribunes. Okay. Let's see here. Gaius, in the meantime, is working on overseas issues. He actually helps repeople the area of Carthage. So, Scipio destroyed it. Scipio the Younger, or defeated it. Scipio destroyed it. The Younger. Gaius is trying to actually rebuild it, not to rebuild Carthage, but to actually help the people who are living there. They actually call the place Genonia. Okay. Once he gets back, he notices that Livius Drusus has been up to no good, that he has actually tried to, in some ways, ingratiate himself to the people to try to kind of take the place of Gaius. Okay. And so he failed to be elected tribune for the third time. Not but that he had the most votes, but because his colleagues, out of revenge, caused false returns to be made. So actually, Livius and others create election fraud. Nothing's new under the sun. There was all these claims about election fraud in the last election, and this is what was happening in Rome as well. Okay, so what ends up happening is that there's actually violence on election day. Some politicians are killed, which actually greatly saddened Gaius. And at that point, the senators and their allies start to plot the assassination of Gaius Gracchus. Okay. There were people who were trying to get him to be more careful around the city because there was a lot of rumors that they were actually plotting his death. But Plutarch points out that Gaius could not be persuaded to arm himself, but put on his gown as if he had been going to the assembly of the people, only with this difference that under it he had a short dagger by his side. As he was going out, his wife came running to him at the gate, holding him with one hand, and with the other a young child. She spoke to him, Gaius, I do not now part with you to let you address the people either as a tribune or a lawgiver, nor as if you were going to some honorable war, when, though you might perhaps have encountered that fate which all must some time or other submit to, you had left me with this mitigation of my sorrow. You go now to expose your person to the murderers of Tiberius, unarmed indeed, and rightly so. So the wife is like, "Why are you doing this? This is you're not really a politician anymore. You've been defeated in office. Why are you trying to, why are you um, encouraging your enemies to do something to you?" At that point, he's going into the marketplace. His the people that have the conspirators that are trying to kill him actually um, corner him. He tries to make his escape, but was pursued so close by his enemies as far as the wooden bridge that from thence he narrowly escaped. There his two trusty friends begged of him to preserve his own person by flight, while they in the meantime would keep their posts and maintain the passage. Okay, as he ran across the bridge, Gaius had no other companion in flight but one, Philocrates, a servant of his. As he ran along, everybody encouraged him and wished for success. So he's basically trying to get out of Rome by the seat of his pants. He gets to the grove, which is kind of outside of Rome, and in that place his servant Philocrates, having first slain him, presently afterwards killed himself also. So basically, they had gotten to his servant and bribed him and bought him off. In that place, though some affirm it for a truth that they were both taken alive by their enemies, and that Philocrates embraced his master so close that they could not wound Gaius until his servant was slain. So there's some actual controversy about whether it was his servant that killed him or somebody else. The point is, they were killed. And Gaius, instead of just being this kind of riot and then throwing the bodies in the river, is almost like an afterthought at this point. Gaius was decapitated, carried away by one of his murderers, and because before the battle began they had made a proclamation that whoever should bring the head either of Gaius or Fulvius should as a reward receive its weight in gold. So basically, they end up getting paid for having killed him, almost like a bounty in how much his head weighed in gold. Okay, these Romans don't mess around. Okay, this is kind of sad. It says here that it is reported that Cornelia, remember the daughter of Scipio and their mother, bore the loss of her two sons with a noble and undaunted spirit. So, in reference to the holy places in which they were slain, she said, "Their dead bodies were well worthy of such sepulchres." She removed afterwards and dwelt near the place called Misenum, not at all altering her former way of living. She had many friends and hospitably received many strangers to her house. Okay, so that's the end of the story of the Gracchi. You might think about who you sympathize more with, Tiberius or Gaius. Clearly, Gaius was much more of kind of a programmatic politician. He had a lot more ideas about how to reform the political system and economic system of Rome. While both were in favor of making lives better for the working man and the common man of Rome, you might say that Tiberius was much more kind of prudent, maybe a little bit more moderate in his politics, where Gaius is a little bit more aggressive, headstrong, and much more democratic in his political and economic instincts. But these two episodes happening, roughly 9 years between each other, really is a very unsettling state of affairs. I mean, you might say that without having really declared it, that there was kind of a mini civil war that was brewing. This was the first time that real violence had been perpetrated inside the Roman Republic since the founding of the Republic. There had been political disputes and political fights, and strikes and all the rest, but they had always seemed to resolve itself. And one of the big ways that Rome resolved its internal conflicts and its class divisions was by going to war. That was always kind of a surefire way of uniting these different orders and classes and tribes by focusing their enmity upon the other, somebody outside of the Roman sphere. But as Rome gets bigger and Rome gets more powerful, Rome gets wealthier, these divisions start to kind of be exacerbated. And the Gracchi are trying to solve this problem, but by 120 BC, it seems like there's really nothing other than maybe a civil war that's going to undo some of these trends. And so what we're going to be looking at from this point forward is, from the Gracchi to Julius Caesar, and then later to Caesar Augustus. Was there some way of warding off this, what starts to look like an inevitability, where the republic is going to be destroyed and the empire take its place? But a lot of people believe that, as a metaphor, that the republic actually died when Tiberius and Gaius' bodies were thrown into the Tiber River. They didn't realize it yet. There were a lot more events that had to take place, and I don't believe in fate. I think there were probably choices that should have or could have been made to forestall such a development. But the bottom line is that the republic was never the same after the Gracchi, and how much of that do they bear responsibility for? Do the ends justify the means? Were they operating outside the constitutional structure? But was that constitutional structure so corrupt and so riven by political corruption that you actually had to go outside the constitutional structure because the Constitution itself was broken? And if you think that's kind of a drastic way of looking at it, there are a lot of people today who believe that for a large extent, we are operating outside of our own constitutional structures for actually quite a long time. So you hope and pray that this is not where we're headed. It's hard to think about decapitating politicians and throwing them in, I don't know, like the Potomac River or something like that. But maybe we just are a little bit more civilized in our civil war. But we are very divided as a country, and Rome was very divided between patricians and plebeians during the Gracchi time. So that's all I have. Work on the Google Forms assignment for this, and we'll have a lecture on Wednesday. And the homework there is you'll turn to the next chapter, where you'll meet people like Marius and Sulla. Ugh, Sulla. I almost shudder at the thought of somebody like him. All right. Have a good day.